In an old wooden house hidden deep in the hills of Kentucky, an attic held a forgotten box. Inside that box rested photographs that should never have been taken. Among them, one album stood apart, bound in worn leather, smelling faintly of dust and age. Each page carried images that, at first glance, might have seemed ordinary until the truth behind them came to light. One picture showed a young woman in a gown of delicate lace, her eyes bright, her smile warm. Beside her stood a tall man, his hand resting with a certain possessiveness on her waist. To anyone unaware, they looked like a hopeful couple from rural America in the early years of the 20th century. Yet this image hid a truth so disturbing that even the most experienced historians hesitated to say it aloud. The bride was Sarah May Bramwell. The groom was her own brother, Thomas Bramwell. This union was not born out of isolation or sudden madness. It was deliberate, designed, and rooted in an unbroken tradition that had rotted in secret for generations. Hidden behind the polished image of Christian values and respectable life, this family practiced something that violated every boundary of human decency. This is the account of the Bramwell family of eastern Kentucky, a bloodline so damaged by its own design that by the time the world learned the truth, the cost had already been paid by children who never had a chance to live free. This is not simply a tale of forbidden affection or small-town seclusion. It is the story of a family who knowingly chose to destroy itself from within, generation after generation, trapping their descendants in a prison built from their own blood. The path to this destruction began long before Sarah May and Thomas were born. It started in 1847, when a man named May Bramwell left his home in Virginia. He was not escaping the law or chasing opportunity in Kentucky's growing coal industry. He was leaving behind whispers, accusations, and shame. Official records from his old community told a different version of events than his descendants would later claim. Those records hinted at something unthinkable, a relationship between Jeremiah and his younger sister, Rebecca. In Virginia, such rumors could ruin a life. In the remote hollers of Pike County, Kentucky, where neighbors lived miles apart and asked no questions, Jeremiah found the perfect place to begin again. There, he could create a life on his own terms, free from interference. And most importantly, he could shape a family according to his twisted belief in bloodline purity. To him, mixing with outsiders weakened strength. True power, he preached, came from keeping blood unbroken, untainted by strangers. His first move in Kentucky was not to take a local bride, but to summon Rebecca from Virginia. She arrived half a year later, already carrying his child. The preacher who married them did not question their identical faces or shared name. A small exchange of money and some altered records turned Rebecca Bramwell into Rebecca Matthews on paper. But in their secluded cabin, she remained exactly what she had always been: Jeremiah's sister, his wife, and the unwilling mother of a legacy poisoned before it began. Their first child, Ezekiel, was born in 1848. At birth, he seemed whole. But by the time he was 3, his speech was broken. One arm hung useless, and his gaze carried a strange emptiness that unsettled even his parents. Jeremiah saw none of this as a warning. He considered it the first step in his great experiment. Ezekiel grew up convinced that his family was blessed by God to remain pure in an impure world. When he reached adulthood in 1870, there was never any question about his future bride. His younger sister Charity had been promised to him since childhood. Their wedding was small, attended by close kin and a few locals who knew better than to ask uncomfortable questions. Charity was already with child before the ceremony. That pregnancy ended with the birth of triplets, each a grim sign of what the Bramwell bloodline had become. The first, Samuel, looked normal but never walked. His twisted legs forced him to crawl like an animal. The second, Ruth, was born with her heart on the wrong side of her chest and died before her 5th birthday. The third Marai bore none of these physical flaws. Instead, he possessed a mind sharper than anyone had seen, as if the damage that destroyed his siblings had been concentrated into his intellect. By 3, Marai could read. By 5, he solved complex problems beyond the reach of grown men. By 10, he was building his own theories on what he called genetic perfection. Through selective breeding, he took his grandfather's crude beliefs and shaped them into something that sounded scientific, at least to those willing to listen. Beneath that brilliance, however, lurked a darker inheritance, a complete inability to see the families, offspring as human beings rather than subjects in his personal experiment. By the mid-1890s, Marai had become the unquestioned head of the family. He married his own sister, Temperance, in keeping with tradition. But his ambitions reached beyond that. He documented every birth, every defect, every death. 7 children were born to him, and Temperance over 12 years. 3 died before they turned 1. 2 survived, but lived dependent and disabled, treated not with compassion, but as failed trials. Only 2 reached maturity: Thomas, born in 1896, strong in body, but hollow in feeling, and Sarah May, born in 1898, striking in beauty, but raised to have no will of her own. From birth, Sarah May's future was fixed. She would wed Thomas, bear his children, and continue what Marai called genetic transcendence. Convinced that the closest blood relations produced the strongest traits, he believed Thomas and Sarah May could create a new kind of human, one superior to ordinary people. He ignored the truth that for every gifted child, countless others died in agony. In 1921, spring warmth returned early to the Kentucky mountains, bringing with it the wedding Marai had awaited for decades. Sarah May turned 23. That March, Thomas was 25. Neither had ever been free to imagine a life beyond each other. On the morning of her wedding, Sarah May sat in the same room where she had slept as a child. Cousins fixed her hair and whispered about the day ahead as though nothing were unusual. She wore Temperance's altered wedding gown and carried mountain laurel from the hillside where generations of Bramwell brides had gathered flowers. No outsiders were present. Fewer than 20 relatives attended. Too many others had already died young. The family line was collapsing under the weight of its own corruption, but Marai saw only the fulfillment of his life's work. Thomas waited at a simple altar in the family's main room, dressed in his father's old suit. His hands were steady, his eyes empty of warmth. To him, Sarah May was not a cherished sister or a beloved bride. She was a chosen participant in an unbroken chain of breeding. A ceremony lasted under 10 minutes. The preacher, paid well to keep silent, avoided any mention of their kinship. Papers were signed, photographs taken, and Sarah May Bramwell remained Sarah May Bramwell. Within months, she was expecting her first child. Marai followed her pregnancy like a scientist observing a critical trial. He recorded her symptoms, her cravings, even her dreams. He calculated bloodline, purity, and predicted this baby would carry the highest concentration of Bramwell blood ever achieved. In early 1922, the child was born. Josiah came into the world with his spine exposed, his skull misshapen, his eyes clouded. His breathing was labored from his first moment. He lived for 6 painful weeks. Sarah May, once obedient to every family command, sat at his side day and night, singing to ears that could not hear, holding hands that could not hold back. Watching him suffer cracked something deep within her. For the first time, she questioned whether their traditions were a blessing or a curse. Thomas felt no such shift. He accepted Josiah's death as part of the process, speaking of his son as data for future breeding. When Sarah May recoiled from his detachment, he reminded her that doubt was betrayal. The second child lived only 3 days. The third survived 2 months before dying in seizures. By 1924, Sarah May had buried 4 infants. That winter, she made a choice no Bramwell woman before her had dared. She would have no more children. Worse, from Marai's view, she began to speak to outsiders. Dr. Marcus Webb, a physician from the county seat, became the first to understand the full scope of the family's history. In hushed confessions, Sarah May told him of deliberate inbreeding. Over 4 generations, of dozens of infant graves, of children born only to live in pain. This was not the accidental tragedy of isolation. It was calculated, sustained, and justified by a twisted vision of human perfection. In 1926, Thomas was found dead in the family's barn, his body failing under the same inherited defects that had claimed so many others. Marai died 2 years later, taking his meticulous records to the grave. Sarah May lived until 1934, never marrying again, dedicating her last years to warning others about the dangers of genetic isolation. The Bramwell land was eventually lost to unpaid taxes, its buildings left to crumble in the hills. Today, in local cemeteries, stones still bear the same surname repeated across generations, a silent monument to the choices that destroyed a family from within. The case of the Bramwells is now used by genetic counselors as a lesson in what happens when ideology blinds people to basic humanity. It is proof that the most horrifying monsters are not always strangers. They can be those who believe their cruelty serves a higher cause, even as it consumes the innocent.